Bethany, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, my name's Bethany Sollereder, and I'm a lecturer in science and religion at the University of Edinburgh, a position I've just taken up about 2 weeks ago. So you can see that all my boxes of books, sorry, I'm pointing the wrong way, are still unpacked here. So I'm just settling in. I specialize in questions surrounding biology, God, and the problem of good and evil. Sort of, if God is good, why is the world so full of suffering as it is? And how do we account for that, especially in a sort of non-human realm where there's no, there's no moral evil that they're causing one another, and yet animals have been killing each other and dying from various things for hundreds of millions of years.
Cool. So could you tell me more about your take on the problem of evil? I love how you said the problem of good and evil. The problem of good. I like that one. So tell me more
Yeah.
about your take.
So I mostly focus, as I said, on animals. I don't pay, I've started to pay more attention to humans more recently, but it's a more complex problem because we
Yeah, they're
usually,
boring anyway.
well,
Boring
yeah,
humans.
and it's just too close. You start talking about human evil, and then you're touching on people's really painful lived experiences. Or if you're talking about, a stegosaurus getting eaten by some sort of theropod, you can sort of think about the issues without the emotional impact in quite the same way. So even as just a way to try and think through the issues, one arm's length removed emotionally, I think it's a helpful thing. So yeah, so there's no the traditional Christian story for why the world sucks is that God made it perfect, and then Adam and Eve chose to go the wrong way in the garden. And the moment you don't have that, because you have an evolutionary history that long precedes humans, you have a theological problem to sort out.
Cool. And so what is your take on that? So if there's no Adam and Eve, no apple, what is the justification for God allowing suffering? Because that's usually the problem of suffering is usually the way I phrase it to include the animal thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are a few different approaches that Christian theologians, philosophers have suggested. One would be to say, well, you can actually deal with the chronological problem, the fact that humans weren't around, by blaming demons, because they've been around since the beginning. I find that less helpful than others do, partially because I think that hands over too much of creation to demonic influence, and of course because it's particularly the ability to suffer and to die that also pushes forward evolutionary development. So it's our capacity to live and to die, to suffer and feel joy, that shapes our lives in such important ways and brings about evolutionary development. So if you get rid of that, it's a problem. So I do think I sort of bite the bullet and say this is God's good world apart from human evil, and think about the
This
way.
including the dinosaurs eating each other?
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, what I do is I look at the nature of love, presuming that God creates in love, and I think that love is inherently uncontrolling. So there's got to be freedom for creatures to make their own decisions, to be agents in their own right, and that doesn't isn't just for humans, but for all creatures. And so I think that the evolutionary process where we see animals deciding to live off of other animals, that's sort of an evolutionary agential choice that they make, whether you want to call it behavioral plasticity or go all the way up to its decision making, it's going to vary depending on what kind of animal we're talking about. We don't um, we see that possibility as being around because of the freedom of love that's offered to creatures.
Well, why wouldn't love be able to be achieved without certain evil? So, for example, I don't have the capability to use magic. I can't use Avada Kedavra from Harry Potter to kill somebody, but I'm still considered free, right? And so it doesn't seem like we need 100% freedom to have whatever freedom is required to be a morally loving world. And
Yeah.
so it seems possible that we could have even less freedom. So, for example, Stephen Hawking was a quadriplegic, but he still had freedom, right?
Well, yeah, and again, you're talking about humans again. And
Well,
so, I mean, I think,
too. So, I just to be clarified. So, like in the
yeah,
case of
yeah,
an
yeah.
animal,
Our freedom is limited by all sorts of things. So it's not absolute freedom to do anything. I can't sort of blow up the world. Although there are some people in our world who genuinely do have that power, which is a bit terrifying. But for most creatures, their ability to choose to harm other creatures is quite limited. And also, some creatures harm other creatures without having any intention. So you could look at viruses or that sort of thing. Lots of viruses live quite happily in other animals without causing any trouble. And then sometimes they cause a great deal of trouble, as we've seen, with the pandemic. So, you know, it. So your question was, how much freedom does God really need to give to have freedom? And I think that it's got to be some freedom. But if you look at where should God draw the line, it gets pretty sticky. So, if you decide, oh, okay, well, animals can bump into each other, but they can't eat each other, then you start really curtailing how they can experience the world and how they interact with each other. And pretty soon, nothing would have a real relationship with anything else. So, I mean, I sometimes talk about, I grew up with brothers, and we're getting into humans again. But if every time, we fought as kids on occasion. So if you can imagine me, absolutely unusually, throwing a punch at my brother. And God didn't want that to happen. So a pillow appears in the air between us, and I hit the pillow instead of my brother. And then he isn't hurt by that, but his feelings are hurt. So he goes to hurl an insult. And God stops the sound waves so that I don't hear it and I'm not hurt by that. Eventually, what sort of relationship do I end up being able to have with my brother? It's pretty limited. And I think the same is true. It's actually very hard to draw a good line. What we do find is that when creatures generally are experiencing unnecessary or unproductive pain, there tend to be ways that our bodies respond to cut down on that. So we can go into shock, we can go unconscious. So we actually do have mechanisms that limit the pain that we can experience in situations.
well, I would say the line would be it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing, which would include animals. So I've included animals in all of these categories. I think any conscious agent has moral value, whether it's a human or an animal. And so I think the line that should be drawn, or should have been drawn if God was all good and all powerful, would have been, he would have made it the world such that no conscious being could force another conscious being to do anything they don't consent to doing. And I think that is a sufficiently good line. So it would include the punching thing. So if your brother tried to punch you, or if a T-Rex tried to bite you, you'd essentially just become like a ghost, ethereal, just pass right through you, no effect. But insults, totally fine. No effect there, unless you want to, like, you can mute your own ears if you want. But I wouldn't limit insults. And so that seems like a sufficient line to allow all of the relationship building requirements to establish a loving universe, whatever kind you want, but without having any kind of gratuitous suffering.
So can you do that without undermining physics?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by undermining physics, because there's
So
essentially infinitely many ways we could
things have
change physics.
integrity. I don't understand how world would work where God would suddenly make things pass through each other harmlessly. And I think that also prioritizes only physical pain over emotional pain. And I don't know that that's right either.
Well, so in the case of physics, like there's ways using the current laws of physics to accomplish that. Quantum entanglement, phasing in and out of different dimensions. It's very hard to violate physics. There's so much physics we can do, or just adding different laws of physics. Since God's all powerful, he can add laws of physics. So it's going to be hard to completely violate physics. There's a lot of variability there. In the case of emotional harm, I would say that each human has the right to what enters their ears, more or less, and you can decide if you want, I don't know,
But you wouldn't
offensive
know what
words.
it is until it's had its effect.
Well, no, you can set it prematurely. So just like on a setting on your computer, you can say, "Would you like to hear offensive words? Yes or no?" Just like on Twitter. So like on Twitter or YouTube, you can block certain words, and so certain words won't show up for you. You could do the same thing with the iPad for your ears. It's like, no, I do
Yeah.
not want to hear the word potato. No, no potato. Block all word uses of the word potato.
Yeah. I just think that that would actually end up with precisely the problem I said, in which we'd never properly encounter others because everything would be so highly uh, shielded. I don't think that that would actually. That's not a world I'd want to live in. Basically,
Well, why?
um,
What is it about that's you would think incapacitates us from having real relationships? Because to me, it seems like if we wanted to, we could choose to live in a world exactly like this one. So if we were in that situation where we're in a world that has that extra conditional rule that it's impossible to force people to do anything they don't consent to doing, you can still consent to living in any potential world. So if you wanted to, you could consent to living in this earth exactly as it is. And so in that best of all possible worlds, it allows us to have all potential relationship options open to us. They just have to be consensual. And so I'm not sure why that would in any way limit our ability to build relationships, even in like a video game analogy context. In a video game, we can still build relationships. We can still fight. We can still have conflict, still feel pain. There are actual attachments that can make you feel pain and draw blood, oddly enough, if you want. And so it seems like there's no limitation to the amount of relationship building you can have in that context. Is just consensual.
I think okay. So there's a couple things I'm wondering. One is what when you say all conscious beings, what counts as consent in that, and also if I predetermine my settings, this is my pain threshold and no higher, then again I don't know what I'm not encountering, but I do know that many of my deepest, richest relationships are deep and rich precisely because there's been struggle that I would have I would have blocked out, you know and so it's the whole process of bumping together, hurting each other, forgiving each other, getting on with things, that has made the bridges of trust and love so strong. But I'm seeing something in the comments. Are these things in heaven? And I think that's a really good point. So I'm saying, well, here on Earth there are certain realities, and yet I do want to look forward to a heaven where those things are not the case, um, where there isn't suffering. But I think, I mean, speculating about heaven is always a bit of a difficulty because I do assume that it works on very, very different um, A, physical bases, and B, moral bases. So here there's a developmental thing going on, whereas there I'm not sure that there would be. So just as there are values here that I think we value, like reproduction and marriage and things like that, the few hints that were given about heaven is that there won't be that kind of good there. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, talks about reproduction in heaven. So I think that there's a flip of, in a physical world where there's reproduction, we need death to keep things within balance. Whereas in heaven, there won't be that there won't be those issues. So there'll be a different set of goods and evils that would mean we could have the good of painlessness. Whereas again, in this world, if you actually felt no pain, it would be a bad thing because you wouldn't know how to protect yourself.
Well, I'm not sure that follows. So, for example, if that argument holds, it's would entail that if there was a greater kind of suffering, for example, magic, the Cruciatus curse, for example, or psychic powers where people could invade your mind and torture you that way, which could arguably be a greater kind of suffering than the kind of physical suffering that we have today. Um, would that entail a greater or deeper relationships with people because they can use the Cruciatus curse on you? I mean, I don't think so. It doesn't seem like it's the case that adding in extra ways to cause more suffering causes deeper relationships in any way. And so it seems like the barrier point is rather arbitrary. And the only thing that's really required to have deep relationships is interaction. Like it seems like people can have equally deep relationships via like cards, male relationships or online relationships that can be equally as passionate even without the ability to physically harm one another. So the example Stephen Hawking I used, Hawking can't punch anybody. He is incapable of punching. No punching, no kicking. But he can still have equally free, deep, loving relationships with someone, even another paraplegic. It doesn't seem like the ability to punch one another adds anything that makes a relationship significantly more meaningful than a relationship between two paraplegics who can't punch one another.
I think, I mean, I'm really, really loath to use a personal example, like to talk about Stephen Hawking, but I would say that I don't think virtual relationships are as rich as in-person relationships. As a person who lives abroad from my family and I've just moved away from all my friends, I'm pretty happy to say that even with deep reach friends, virtual reality is no, absolutely no equal exchange with being with people in person. So I don't think that's a case that these are just sort of this would be an equal exchange. But think about being physically in the world. So there are people who are born without the capacity to feel pain, and they usually don't live very long or very good quality of life because they don't know how to protect themselves physically. So they damage themselves, they'll run their head into walls and just sort of think it feels kind of neat. And because pain is uncomfortable, it's part of what tells them that they need to moderate their behavior. And the same thing is true of what used to be called leprosy is now called Hansen's disease. That's a bacterial infection of the pain nerves. It slowly kills the pain nerves. But the damage we associate with leprosy, like fingers falling off and stuff, doesn't come from bacterial infection. It comes from people not knowing how to protect themselves. Or, in one case, there were rats that were eating off patients' fingers while they slept. And because they didn't feel pain, they didn't wake up. So, so pain is necessary as a biological creature in this world. I just don't, this is the world we have. And I don't think it's usually very helpful to kind of say, well, I can imagine another physical universe where all of this would go away and we'd still have all the benefits and none of the deficits. I'd rather say, okay, in this world as it is, would you rather live without physical pain or with it? And I would say with. And I think the same is true of social pain, emotional pain, that emotional pain is part and parcel of learning to live well in groups and in relationship. And there are people who don't feel emotional pain in relationships. And we usually consider that a really pathological way to live, to live without remorse, to live without pain. Usually is not beneficial to that person or the community around them.
So a few things there. One is that virtual relationships right now clearly aren't as meaningful because we don't have the same level of sense experience, but we could, like in the future, is quite likely that we'll be able to replicate pretty much every sense experience via digital space. We'll like put on a headset or whatever, and it'll just be able to be with loved ones and feel physical touch, smells, sights, everything. But it doesn't seem like placing a limit on that, a limiter that says, well, you're not allowed to feel excruciating pain, like if they stab you, will in any way hinder the meaningfulness of the relationship. It seems like when you have a long distance relationship or a short distance relationship with a loved one, it doesn't seem like the ability for them to stab you adds anything to the quality of the relationship. And so I don't see why that is required for any kind of meaningful relationship whatsoever. It just seems to be a gratuitous amount of suffering. Secondly, I'm think that looking at it from the perspective of saying, in this world as we are now, would we rather have X or Y? Doesn't really seem like a fair comparison, because the argument here of the problem of evil is more, is there a logically possible world where we could have all of the benefits and none of the consequences? If so, then God choosing to make a lesser world inherently makes him bad or evil or a bad decision. Kind of like a doctor in the 1800s. If a doctor in the 1800s cut your leg off, it's just the best he could do with the tools he had. If a doctor today cut your leg off, you're going to sue him for malpractice because he's not giving you the antibiotic to save your leg. He's just going to cut your leg off. It's clearly bad. And so I think the same standard would apply to God. If God, with his infinite power, because he's omnipotent, could have made a logically possible world without even one of the negative aspects, but still kept the positive aspects, that seems to prove definitively that he's not a good God, or not an all-powerful God, the Epicurus quadrilemma thingy. And so simply looking at it from our pragmatic perspective of what would we like in our world with or without emotional or physical pain, doesn't seem to be a proportional comparison to the claim that of an omnipotent being. If you're going to make that claim, it seems like you have to compare it to all logically possible worlds, since you're saying he can do all logically possible things. But yeah, so the first one is like, I still don't see why a digital relationship wouldn't be equally as meaningful as a physical relationship if we could mimic all sense experience, but limit it at no stabbing.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the holodeck experiment, right? Where it has the mortality filter and the that kind of thing. I think insofar, I mean, at that point, what you need is some sort of physical mechanism where God comes in and prevents stabbing, right? Because we have a world where if touch is possible, and being able to push somebody out of the way of a car is possible, then stabbing them is also possible. These are all kind of consistent with our abilities. So what you would need to do is sort of come in and say, you could do this and this and this and this, but there's that moral filter that comes in and has some sort of mechanism that turns off that action. And I think that is, again, you end up having it sees divine intervention as a possibility, as what interrupts the world rather than what empowers the world. So I don't see divine intervention as that kind of power. I
Well,
see
what do you mean
God.
by divine intervention there? Because my idea, it's not like God is literally watching every action and be like, nope, stop, no, no, stop. It's more like a law of physics. We just added an extra law of physics that if you're not consenting, then your quantum field is disaligned such that their quantum field can't interact or something along those lines. So it's not a manual
Yeah,
supernatural
but
intervention of any kind.
you're asking it to operate on a moral standard, not on a physical standard, right? So you're asking for, because exactly the same action could be good in one situation, bad in another. So, right, so the surgeon in essence stabs their patient, but does it for the right reason. So you're asking for the physical world to interpret moral standing.
Well, I'm a
That's
moral
what
naturalist.
Sorry?
I'm a moral naturalist, so I think morality is physical. So that wouldn't be too hard. But you could, instead of saying a moral state, a psychological state or something, a consciousness state, brain states of the victim and the perpetrator, or some kind of relationship between the conscious states. And so you could still use physical states to determine which actions would be consensual or not. It's like a computer. Like
Yeah.
in a computer, I can just say, no, this word, just ban the word potato. That's a
Yeah.
physical state about ones and zeros. So it would still be all physical.
I don't know if, and again, kind of what, so if you have a very unskilled surgeon, but you have a person who consents to surgery from them, and then they basically stab them in the bad way, is that would happen, but not if they have questions about the surgery? Like it, I think it would be very, very difficult to have any kind of consistent world. You couldn't have science in that world. You
Why?
Because you need the same thing to happen every time for science to work, more or less,
Not
right?
really. I mean,
You need consistent. You think if completely, if I drop my pen this time and I drop it next time and it floats away, that I could still have a scientific.
yes, that's literally quantum mechanics. It is probabilistic and random. Random things happen. But science is really just
Well,
measuring
or
patterns.
we don't have a full sense of the quantum world, you
It's
know.
possible,
So
but the consensus right now in physics is that randomness is in fact a force in and of itself. And so even if that's the case, it doesn't invalidate science. We just grant it's a force and say, okay, it's random, happens with probability X. It wouldn't
yeah,
eliminate
I
science for randomness to be a thing.
yeah. I mean, again, I'd rather stick to what we, to the real world we're in, rather than, make up things. So, I mean, I could say, well, actually, God saw a world where the Cruciatus curse was possible and limited that by not allowing magic. So I could say, actually, God's already done all of that, and this is the perfectly balanced world. But that would be just as unhelpful an argument as saying, well, I can think of a better world. I'd rather say, okay, given this world, what is the picture of God that we come to? And what are the possibilities there?
Wasn't that begging the question? Because I think the point of the problem of evil is to say that if there's an all powerful, all loving, perfect being, uh, then the standard we would have to hold him to is a much higher standard than our pragmatic standard. And so trying to look at our pragmatic standard and infer what the being would like would probably get us something more like an anthropocentric Zeus kind of a thing, a human inspired thing, not really a divine being. And so if we're trying to hold him to this absolute objective standard, it seems like you must envision all logically possible worlds. And if any one of them entails all the positives and not one of the negatives, then that definitively shows that God can't be good. Um, but simply starting from our perspective and saying, trying to make God fit what we see seems to be like just begging the question. I don't see why that would be
I mean,
the
yeah, I
go ahead.
mean, and this is where I kind of say, like, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a Christian theologian. So I'm interested in having the conversation, given the world, can we believe that God is good? I'm not interested in trying to prove to the atheist skeptic that God is good, precisely because you end up in those sort of things where you're trying to decide what all logical worlds mean, and that's an exploration that just doesn't make sense to me, because I don't think we actually have a grasp of what to know what a possible world would be like. We'd have to understand this world a whole lot better than we do, and because we don't know all the factors that have gone into the making of this world, and therefore I don't think we can decide which things we can do without. But given this world, can I think of God as good? And that's where I think that sort of the freedom that emerges out of love, seeing God's work as empowering rather than preventing, seeing God as creating the possibilities of life, the possibilities of goodness, but also the possibilities where evil can emerge, is it seems to be much more satisfying.
So what comes to mind for me is like when you ask the question, can I think of God as good? Uh, from my perspective, it seems like that would entail thinking about logically possible worlds versus just saying, can I imagine there's a good God that would do the things we see? The first thing that comes to mind is the Hitler example. Like, can you create a justification for Hitler to allow what he did and still think of him as good? And in order to like assess the morality of that, you would assess the limitations of what Hitler, his power, and then compare that to his actions and say, could he have done something better? Yes or no. And if he could have done something better, then clearly he's immoral. And in the context of God, since he's all powerful, it seems like you have to think of all of those possible worlds in order to be able to answer the question, can I think of God as good and allowing this?
Yeah, so that idea of sort of justifying has it assumes that we know what sort of weights to put on the scales of justice. And I don't assume that we have that knowledge. Because I've genuinely gone down that path and genuinely asked, can we justify? But I think that there are too many factors, So in theory, if I throw a feather off the top of the building that I'm standing on, it is determinate where it will fall. But all the supercomputers on Earth couldn't actually calculate that because there's way too much, that would be within chaotic motion and that it's simply not predictable. Right. So when it comes to can God, is this instance of suffering justifiable? I think philosophically, that's like trying to figure out exactly where the feather will land. There probably is an answer, but it's not one that we know how to calculate, and maybe never will. If John Polkinghorne is right that epistemology models ontology, but so I'm this is going to be disappointing, I'm sure, because that whole idea of we can really justify, can you justify this? I'm going to say, well, no, I can't, but I can, I think, get to the point of seeing a picture of creation and God, where God is good, while trying to hold and face the realities that this world has.
That's interesting because I usually think about it the opposite way. I think that trying to answer the question for an individual particular seems like a far less complicated question than to answer the more general topic. And so for me, it's like trying to solve a super complicated calculus problem and saying we can solve this, but trying to solve like an individual 1+1 problem. No, we can't solve that one. And so my intuition conflicts with those two things. It seems like it would be the opposite, that we should be able to answer for the particular before we claim to be able to answer for the general.
Yeah, I think the reason I find the particular so difficult is because there's so many. I have an insider's view of the complexity that's going on, right? And I can also see, even more difficult, is how time changes my perception of things I've gone through. So you'll know this story, the Taoist farmer, right, who his only horse, which is his whole livelihood, runs away, and all the villagers come and go, oh, this is the worst thing that ever happened. He says, well, I don't know. A few days later, it comes back, and a whole herd of wild horses come with it. Now he's the richest man in the village, and everyone goes, wow, this is so great, And then, his son is training one of the new horses, and it breaks his leg really badly. And everybody goes, oh, yeah, they were all a curse. This is terrible. And then, their armies go, their countries go to war, and all the other sons from the village end up being taken off and die. And that farmer, as you'll know, he keeps his son. So, how that's where you've got the feather floating in the wind, running around, and for each, I think every single instance of suffering has that kind of complexity to it.
Well, what would be the difference with the general case?
I think with the general case, I can say things in general, like if I have the chance, if I'm in a physical body, then feeling pain is better than not being able to feel pain. And we can look in general things like the opioid crisis, right? So many of those people sought relief from their pain for really good reasons. And in compassion, we gave them an ability not to feel pain, which actually ended up causing far more suffering than their initial complaint did.
Well, why
Um,
isn't that like a particular? Because if you say, is it better to feel suffering in a physical body? That seems like a particular, just like the feather falling or the guy with the horse. It seems like just as to us, it from our intuitive perspective that we couldn't live without suffering because it adds so much to our lives and teaches us how to live. And if we didn't have it, we'd have the diseases you mentioned where we'd not be able to survive. Well, maybe if we lose that horse, a whole bunch of other horses will come. And there'll be a better way to live, like in the digital hypothetical world where we can feel pain, but not no stabbing or something. And that could be like the troop of horses. And so why would we not treat the individual ability to feel suffering in a physical body as a particular that could also be improved in the future?
I think it can be improved in some ways. So I think, we've made great strides in dentistry, and I'm so glad I live in this century and not another one. Um, but I think that what we tend to seek is not improvement, but the elimination of suffering. And so, I mean, and somebody like Philip Clayton would point this out, is that as soon as we eliminate something really terrible, then our limits become, this is now the really terrible thing that ought to be eliminated. And now that's the really terrible thing that ought to be eliminated. And now, I mean, we are the most comfortable human generation that has ever lived by miles and miles and miles. And yet, if you ask people, how are you doing? Most people will complain about the pain they're in, et cetera, and how life is difficult, et cetera. So I'm thinking about your all digital world, and I'm going to the Matrix, and they say, well, we tried to make a perfect world, but humans kept rejecting it, and I mean, there's limited amounts that we can draw on sci-fi with any, sort of rigor, but I do think that what I see in the modern world is that no matter how comfortable we are, we're always going to seek more comfort. That whatever is uncomfortable will now become the thing that we ought to live without. And that's again kind of coming back to we would eventually lose relationship with the real world.
Well, that's where I think I disagree, because in the case of video games, we see the opposite is the case, where we've reached a level of comfort and now we seek more discomfort. So we're getting harder and harder video games that are extremely frustrating at times, but they're chosen. We choose to play Dark Souls and die 5,000 times before we beat the boss once. We choose to play Ninja Gaiden and Super Meat Boy because they're just in pain. They're painfully difficult games, and so it seems like there is some balancing point where humans will voluntarily choose to experience suffering. So I agree we shouldn't get rid of all suffering, but what we should have get rid of is non-consensual suffering. That seems to be a good break point where when people can choose it, they get equally as much or greater value than not choosing it and can still get all of the benefits of the relationship and character building, but it's consensual now rather than non-consensual. And so I agree we shouldn't get rid of all suffering, just get rid of the non-consensual suffering.
Right. Yeah. I uh, I don't know what to say to that, except that, I'm not sure that it's physically possible to do that and still maintain the goods, just because suffering does have that. But I do like the idea of us, challenging. And I sort of think, and if they consent to it, are you then happy for them to experience horrific pain? So what my mind went to is sort of free climbing. So you have people who could have ropes, but they choose not to, and every
Adam
once
and Sarah.
in a
Oh,
while they die
so
horribly,
scary.
right? So like, is that legitimate if they've consented to that, which clearly they have, for them to
Yep.
feel the crushing of bones, et cetera, et cetera?
Yep. If it's consensual, it's totally okay. So I'd be for,
I mean, they don't want to die.
yeah. So like if they consent to even euthanasia, where someone does consent to die, then it becomes moral to kill them. If someone consents to playing like football, where you can get your legs broken and they get their legs broken, totally consensual. If you consent to boxing or UFC where you can get your arms broken, totally fine. So I think that if you consent to the most grievous of all possible suffering, like to be permanently enslaved and tortured, and that's what you, and you're in a healthy state of mind and not like mentally handicapped or a child or whatever, then that is perfectly moral for you to be put through that if you've consented to it.
Okay, interesting. And so what would we do with animals where there's no sense of consent and there's no ability to understand what consent would mean?
The zoos, very large zoos.
Interesting.
With the flies, you got the fly zone and the mosquito zone, and we have to like give them
What,
raindrops of
what would
blood, or
they
like
yeah, what would they eat?
we have to have the Star Trek food generator. Press a button and
Ah,
the steaks fall for the lions.
okay. So yeah, again, sort of drawing on science fiction. Yeah, and I mean, I don't. Some people are like, whatever is natural is good, and I'm like, lots of what happens out there is not great. Like my cat would be pretty miserable if I released him to the wild.
Yep.
He's pretty happy lounging around and only getting getting food on regular bases. So I'm not sort of everything that the natural world is good and we should just take that as the way it is. But I do think that it takes a lot of reflection. One of the things I want to talk about with this is that I think as we've uncovered, there's lots of possibilities and lots of things. And so one of the oh, and you know what? Think I forgot to bring it. But what I wanted to do was I wrote a book that's like a choose your own adventure game. So what it is you read a couple of pages and then you have a choice to make. Is God good and loving? Is and powerful, or is God powerful but doesn't care? Does God not exist? And you turn to different pages depending on sort of what you want to choose. And there are atheist paths, and there are Christian paths, and there are in between paths. And it's precisely because I think that a lot of the value in this is not being told what I think about something, but in sort of being able to explore different paths. And you have ideas like God is a mystery, or and we shouldn't try and figure it out, or all the way down to if God did exist, then is so evil that we should spend all our time protesting against God's ability to exist. Yeah, and so I appreciate the sort of idea of being able to explore these sorts of questions, and I don't think that there are easy answers.
Yeah, for me, like intuitively, it seems like in order to answer the question that whether or not God is good or whether or not we can see God as good, it seems like you would first want to answer, is it possible? Is one of these worlds even logically possible? I think for me, that's a requirement to be able to try to figure that out. And just looking at it from the perspective of this world seems harder for me to accept, or harder for me to try to understand that perspective of just starting from this world and seeing, can we see God as good just starting with this world without thinking about the possibilities? That's a perspective I haven't
How do you know if
considered as
any of
much.
your possible worlds are actually possible?
Well, they're possible via logical possibility. Like possible just means no logical
Not
contradiction.
very convincing, though. I mean,
What do you mean?
well, I mean, an anti-grav hoverboard is logically possible, but it's not actually physically possible, right? So I mean,
What do you mean? We actually have those. We do have those. They do exist.
not an anti-grav one. I mean, we might have a hovercraft, that pushes down really hard.
Well, I think
Um,
they're actually in physics
or
working on anti-gravity certain things where it's hilarious that like I forget what they're called, the anti-gravity particles of using whatever
yep.
the opposite of the graviton. I don't know what it is, but it's physically possible, just not with the known physics.
Not with the known physics. Yeah, so I guess like part of the reason that I just want to start with this world is because we only have a universe. We have one example of a real world. And I just think that there's a lot of things that you can come up with, and then all you need is somebody else saying, well, that relationship is not actually possible. Like I just don't think that logic is a very good guide to truth in a lot of the cases. Right? So you had people arguing that it was logically impossible to, oh no, what was it?
Do everything, play
The
chess, fly
antipodes
faster than
the
sound
antipodes could,
travel.
sorry?
Oh, there's a lot. People have claimed everything's impossible. It's impossible for a computer to beat a human at chess. It's impossible for object that has a greater mass than water to float. It's impossible for things to fly faster than the speed of sound.
Yeah.
Einstein claimed something was impossible. I forget what it was,
Yeah.
though. Newton claimed it was impossible to calculate the orbits of the planets all
Yeah.
together, and then
Do the
Laplace did it.
retrograde motion, etc. Yeah.
Yep.
So exactly. So like all of this where people say, well, this is impossible or that's possible. I just kind of go, well, I don't know. And I don't think we know. So why don't we work with what we actually do know rather than spend our time sort of speculating wildly? And it's exactly why I don't spend a lot of time talking about what heaven is like. Because I think that runs into the same thing. I go, well, God says it'll be good. I'll hang out with that, but I won't spend too much time. Rather, I'd like to see what we can do in this world, because actually these questions, what we think the best world looks like, plays with our ethics in day-to-day life, whether that's dealing with climate change, dealing with medicine, dealing with, so for a long time, what we've said is a longer life is a better life. And now we're sort of seeing, well, we got the longer life, but I'm not sure that's always better, and we're having to revise that. I think that, again, with the opiates, getting rid of pain is always the right choice, always the right choice. And now we're realizing like, oh, not always the right choice, and I think we'll see similar sorts of things with the digital world and its impact on us. I think we'll see similar things with some of the medications we use. But even when we think of climate change, one of the interesting things is that this climate that we're experiencing, that has been here for 11,000 years, is not any kind of planetary norm. So over the last 500,000 years, the average temperature was 4 degrees colder. During the whole time that dinosaurs were on Earth, the minimum temperature was about 7 degrees warmer than now. So if we're looking at this and we think, well, we need to maintain this temperature no matter what, you kind of go, okay, then we're really actually asking about, should we be geoengineering the Earth to our preferences and to those animals that are living right now? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I'm just sort of saying we often take whatever status quo we're used to as the way it ought to be, rather than kind of saying, actually, we live in a highly changeable planet.
So one thing is, I think there isn't a parity between impossible and possible. So normally when people claim something's possible, they usually end up being right. When they claim it's impossible, they're pretty much always wrong. It's almost universally wrong when someone claims something's impossible. But I think the tendency for possible is, there's that I forget who the quote is from, which technology 500 years in the future is indistinguishable from magic. And so I think that when thinking about these future worlds and what is possible, it seems very likely that we will get to the stage where we will be able to have what seems impossible to us now, levels of freedom, essentially, in the future. I think once we get artificial general intelligence, we will all essentially become pandas in giant zoos, and then the AI will do everything for us, which will be... I look forward to that. I'm happy with this. I want to be a panda.
I mean, I'm happy with self-driving cars. Like, let's bring them in. Let's do that. But I don't want to be a panda in an AI zoo. I do not consent.
But
yeah,
I still think it's really important to look at it from the perspective of what can God do, because it's, for me, the first step of answering the question, is God moral, is to look at, for any moral question, is to say, what can a being do, And then, given what that being can do, is it living up to the most moral action it can take, or is it doing something less than the most moral it can take? And I think that's why the logical possibility is so important, because God is all powerful. The omnipotent thing is really what seems to necessitate including those logically possible worlds. Because if we can imagine
Yeah.
it, it's logically possible. God must necessarily be able to do it.
I'm not sure that omniscience or omnipotence should be understood that way. So there's a few theologians. I'm thinking of Tom Ward, but other people like Jürgen Moltmann and others who would actually just say that God's power is not expressed through that sort of God could do anything God wants. And so anything logically possible is available to God. So they would still say God is omnipotent, but that's really not what they would mean by that at all. And much of the classical tradition would agree with that.
Could
So
you say
I
that
think
again? Because I thought
you're discussing a philosopher problem, whereas the theological problem is slightly different from that.
could you say that again? Because I thought you said it is possible for him to do anything logically possible, or it's not possible for him to do anything logically possible.
No, so logically possible is not what constrains God's action, but acting according to the nature of love is what constrains God's action. And that's a very, very different set of constraints.
Gotcha. And how would you define love in this context?
So someone like Aquinas would say that it is desire for the good of the beloved and desire for union with the beloved.
And you think it's impossible to achieve both of those without the level of suffering we have in this world?
I can't answer that. But I think that this world is consistent with a God who loves the world.
What would anything be inconsistent with that? Is there some level of suffering
Yeah.
that we could see?
So it has less to do with sort of the level of suffering and more to do with the ability for creatures to self, for them to be themselves and become themselves. It has more to do with the ability for creatures to develop capacities to love. So suffering is not really the main consideration.
So what would that mean? Like, what would a world have to be like where you can't be yourself?
So if you were in a zoo, for example, so if we were automatons, if we didn't have any sort of freedom at all, and of course any freedom we have is constrained, as you've already pointed out. So it's not saying we have to have full freedom to do anything our wills desire, but if we didn't have moral freedom, for example, that would be a problem. If we didn't have freedom of consent when it came to our ability to love or not to love, for example.
But other than that, like, for example, if we were in a world where everyone was literally tortured 24/7, as long as you included the ability to love or whatever, would that still consider God good in that context?
I think
Or would you be able to conclude that he was good in that context? To think of him as good in that context?
yeah, I think that conclusion might be harder to get to in that world, but I think it still might be possible. But again, that's not this world. So again, I really do tend to resist the sort of thought experiments that philosophers seem to love so much. Just because I go, well, I don't know what that world would look like, and it depends When you just say being tortured, I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's physical torture, mental torture, whether that means, your big toe is pricked once a day, or whether that means you're going through the Cruciatus curse. I would think if you're going through the Cruciatus curse, probably you've lost all freedom at that point at any rate. So there wouldn't be the necessary freedom. But etc. etc.
Must watch Thor: Love and Thunder once a day, every day. But so like my
I've seen Ragnarok, but I haven't seen Love and Thunder. Is it good?
The reviews say it's not good. I haven't seen it yet, but the reviews are very unsatisfied.
Oh no! Oh, that's disappointing because I've liked the Thor movies.
Me too.
Okay, the Dark World one was terrible, but we won't remember that one.
Yep. Well, so my concern is that any world where we have essentially the ability to think, I imagine we'd also have the ability to love. So for some kind of free thought, free love world, but the constraints on what that would entail mean that essentially it seems like there's no world that you could live in where you were capable of thought that you would not be able to conclude God was good. It just applies to literally everything. There's nothing you could see in the world that would be like, yeah, definitely not. God, not good for doing this. This is bad.
So in a sense, what I'm saying is any created world would be good.
So I'm thinking of it from the other perspective. Like if we're in a world and we're trying to assess, if we look at the world, could we conclude God wasn't good from looking at this world? And in order to, we have to think of something. We have to have free thought to some degree, in order to conclude things. And I think that the level of free thought would entail the ability to love, because it's, I would say, a part of the free consciousness thingy. And so any world where we have that, is there a condition where we could see something and be like, nope, God definitely not good? Or no matter what we see, would we always conclude God is good no matter what?
Yeah, I think, people will act on their own intuitions in regard to that. So somebody like Wesley Wildman, who I deeply admire as a thinker and a fellow explorer in the world, has said, well, God's just not in the caring business. God exists, but is the one who gives possibility to all others. So he looks at the same things that I do and comes to a different conclusion. I don't think arguments really change people on that level, at least not philosophical arguments. I think.
Well, I specifically asked about you in this case. I did say us, but I was like, from your perspective.
Would there be things? I don't know if I can answer that here now, because what I can say is none of the suffering that I have encountered has made me conclude that. Whether there could be in the future, it would see, like, how can I answer that? I haven't experienced it yet. I know that's not the answer you're looking for, but I genuinely, I do not have the data to be able to answer that. There might be, but nothing I've encountered so far has led me to that conclusion. Gotcha. But I think it's. I had a discussion once with Richard Dawkins, and we were talking over these things, and he's going like, "Why are you a Christian? You seem intelligent." Well, thanks. I seem it. That's helpful. And I sort of said, like, let me ask you a question. I'm not trying to lead you around. I just said, why do you speak English? Like, it's a horrifically impractical, irrational language. You should speak Esperanto. Like, that's the proper language.
Yes. I like binary. Big binary fan.
Yeah. Like, go learn Esperanto. If you're devoting your life to rationality, stop using this crazy language. And so we talked a little bit about how the possibility of language structures our possibilities of thought and vice versa, and that we're constrained by our language in all these different ways. And then I said, Christianity is the grammar of my being. It's how I think. It's how I see the world. It's not like I sort of followed a bunch of rational propositions and decided, yes, I'm going to be a Christian now. You know, it would be as alien to me to come to the conclusion that God is not good as it would be for me to think in binary. Like I wouldn't even know how to start. And I think that's where we often get in these conversations is I go, well, I don't, I don't feel that, if I could just cross the T's and dot the I's a little bit better, you'd suddenly say, my eyes have been opened. I can now see the goodness of God in a way I didn't before. That's not going to happen in this. But I think
that's actually really interesting. Like, so if I took it from the reverse perspective, what would I need to see to believe God was good? Like, my intuitive response would be something like that we're all in the Matrix and that he didn't actually drown babies. That's all like figurative, didn't happen. And we all consented to be here. We all consented to be in this world. We just forgot. Then that would be it. But if I was to be asked, the Old Testament was literally true. He literally drowned babies, a global flood thing. Would I be able to believe God was still good? Would I be able to grant that and still believe God was good? I don't think I could. I think it's kind of the same thing where seeing mass drowning of people, specifically babies, is just so intrinsically immoral. I don't think it's possible for me to see that as a moral action, no matter what justification could ever be provided.
Yeah.
So I think the same thing would apply.
I don't think that God went out of God's way to drown babies, So I don't think that that's the case, but that's because I don't think that's how God acts in the world, which is kind of part of what I've been saying. But setting aside literalistic interpretations of biblical passages, is there a way that you could look at the world and say God is good?
Yeah. So if we all just consented to be here, so God generates our souls in heaven. He says, "Would you like to be? I created this world for you. It's a testing ground. You can gain these certain character building traits. Would you like to be there?" And we all check the box. I consent. And then perfectly moral. Then that God would be a perfectly moral God and did nothing wrong.
Okay, so actually, there are some Christians, I think Origen, who thought that souls were pre-existent, and that in a sense we did fight to be here. So if Origen is right, and I mean most people think Origen is wrong, but if Origen was right, you'd be like, okay, I'm on board with this.
Yeah. So in that context, I wouldn't see that version of God as having as much. The problem of evil would not be a criticism of that interpretation of Christianity.
Okay. So you place such a high value on consent. It's really interesting. It's interesting just because through the history of suffering, that's never been a huge point of contention. I think that's coming out just in our moment as really the prime consideration.
You cut out there for a second. Could you say that again?
Sorry. I was going to say, that's really a sort of our moment consideration, that consent is the highest of all sort of moral imperatives.
What was your point with that? Because from my perspective, I think I see more progress.
Find it fascinating. I think it's a real shift from how the question has been discussed over, the thousands of years it has been discussed.
Gotcha. Yeah, I see it as like progress in physics. No one was talking about quantum fields 200 years ago, but now, and so I'm a moral realist. So I believe in objective morality, like most philosophers, surprisingly.
Yeah.
And so
I'm seeing the comments go like, do you say consent doesn't matter? No, I'm not saying consent doesn't matter. I'm just saying that's a huge shift in the discussion that it's interesting to observe. Sorry for interrupting you.
Oh yeah, I think that's definitely rational to annoy the chat as much as possible. Give me lots of analytic points. They'll respond. It'll be great. But yeah, so I definitely agree that there has been a shift in the way we view morality over time. I think moral progress is a thing. Women's rights, LGBT rights, vegans don't eat meat. I think that there's been huge progress in strides of morality, and I think we are making progress in understanding more about what is fundamentally moral. just like we are in science. And so I think that makes perfect sense. That is the case.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think it will be an interesting thing, because I think in a century or two from now, when they look back at us, that will actually be a defining point. And I just for everyone's not, I do think consent is important. I'm not arguing it's not. Um, yeah, I think there's a place though for saying that I can trust in what I don't understand. So I think the place where consent gets sticky is when there's a good offer that I can't understand, but if I could understood it, I would want it.
Say that again.
So if there was a good that I would want if I could understand it, but I can't understand it. So, analogy with my cat. My cat, say, breaks his paw jumping off a high cabinet or something. The last thing he wants to do is be put in his carrier case, taken to the vet, and put into surgery. But I do that against his consent because it's the best thing for him, regardless of how he feels about it in the moment. I
Oh
would
yeah, absolutely.
So I think that there are probably parallels between my understanding of reality and real reality as it exists.
Well, that's the
That-
part I would disagree with, because that's the part where I'd say that the lesser evil is only a requirement if you are limited. So, say your cat broke his paw, and you had the option to either snap your fingers and instantly heal him, or shove him in his carrier case, put him in the car for like 30 minutes, and then go to the doctor, where the doctor has to give him shots and surgery. I think you would be immoral for forcing your cat to go through that unnecessarily. So, if you have the choice to just snap your fingers and fix your cat, the unknown one is probably bad to do. Just instantly healing your cat, which your cat could potentially understand at least, or would not be upset with at least, would probably be a less bad option.
yeah. Yeah. So I think that again, our sort of models of divine action are very different. I think there's very few things where God can snap God's fingers and have something happen magically, as it were. I think God is committed to the processes of the universe the same way we are. So it means that the long, slow process is possibly the only way for God as well.
Well, what about the initial starting conditions of the universe? I imagine, did God have the ability to determine the initial starting conditions of the laws of physics? He could snap those into existence, more or less.
So, okay, let's say I don't know the answer to that, but let's say that God did, right? Given randomness as a basic attribute of the world, then there's no way for God to determine what's happening in 2022 by carefully controlling the initial conditions. So even, so it's not necessarily the case that by controlling initial conditions that God could determine whether or not my cat breaks his paw today.
Yeah, I'd consider that to be also a valid response to the problem of evil. I would class that as him not being omniscient of some kind, but I would definitely consider that a valid solution for sure.
Okay. Yeah. And again, omniscient may, again, I'm sort of on the open theist camp where omniscient means knowing all that is logically possible to be known, not knowing past, present, and future in their entirety. Because I agree, if knowledge of the future were possible, then initial conditions would be enough. But I don't think that is the case.
Cool. Well, we've been going for a little over an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any
Yeah.
links or references where people can find more about your work?
Yeah, I've got two books. One I think is called God, Evolution, and Animal Suffering. And then probably the more interesting one is the Why Is There Suffering? Pick Your Own Theological Expedition, where you get to, choose your own ways through. Some other people I really admire. I mentioned Wesley Wildman, people like Philip Clayton, Stephen Knapp, Chris Southgate. Eleanor Stump does a really good book, Wandering in Darkness. Those are some of the people that I read, and
Awesome.
I enjoy them. Hey, thanks so much. This is a really fun conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Me too. Really appreciate you coming on. And I'm going to give my scheduler Jeff all those names so he can send emails to all of them and make him do all of the work. But I really appreciate it.
Excellent.
Thanks again for
Yeah.
coming on. I
Hey,
hope
take
you have a
care.
wonderful rest of your day.